Welcome to the Real News Network. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and I'm coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Turkey has been in the headlines a lot recently. A major bombing in the capital of Ankara that killed 36 people last week, Turkey's attacks on Kurds in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, the shutdown of one of the country's largest circulation newspapers recently, and President Erdogan's equating of dissent with terrorism. And finally, also the deal with the European Union to keep refugees from traveling to EU countries. These are a lot of issues to talk about. And with us to talk about with some of them, since we can't possibly get to all of them, is Professor Fuat Keyman, who is a Turkish political scientist, the director of Istanbul Policy Center, and professor of international relations at Sabancı University. Also, he is the editor of the book Democracy, Identity, and Foreign Policy in Turkey. He's joining us from Istanbul, Turkey. Thanks for joining us, Professor Keyman.
Thank you, pleasure.
There's so much to talk about with regard to Turkey at the moment. So for today, I'd like to focus mostly on the issues of Turkey's relationship with the Kurds and also with the European Union. So, and maybe at a future date, we can get to some of the other issues. But so last week there was this bombing for which the government of President Erdogan blamed the PKK, and he then launched numerous airstrikes against the PKK positions in Kurdistan. In the Kurdish area of northern Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit about what is going on in the relationship really between the government of Turkey and the PKK and the movement of the Kurds in Turkey? It seems to have deteriorated quite severely, given that there were peace talks a while ago, and given that a number of political freedoms a couple of years ago were granted, but now seem to be more and more restricted. So, give us a brief summary as to what's happening in that relationship.
I mean, not only for the outside people observing Turkey, even for us, it is very difficult to understand exactly what is happening in terms of the Kurdish question. The last 2 years, we have been going through what you actually mentioned, the peace talks between the Turkey and the PKK, in which the main motto was to end the conflict, the violence, and to start what was called the era of politics and deliberation. And last 2 years, there was no martyrs, there was no killings, there was no dead bodies coming from the mountains, and everybody was happy. The life was normalized in the southeast. I went there a number of times, and people were happy. People were enjoying what they called normality in life. No violence, just a routine, going to job, coming back home, walking on the streets. And this actually went almost 2 years talks. The aim was to disarm the PKK and the end of conflict. And also the Kurdish actors and the leader, Abdullah Öcalan, gave the motto that Kurds could gain more through politics and deliberation than conflict. And as a matter of fact, the last 3 elections, one local, one general, and one presidential, Kurdish political party, People's Democratic Party, has increased its popular support and popularity, in so much so that in the 7th of June election, they have gained 80 MPs in the Turkish parliament, which actually put them on the third, party in the parliament, 3rd out of 4 parties in the parliament. But in terms of political effectivity, we all actually consider the Kurdish party, HDP, People Democratic Party, from now on I will say HDP, as even main opposition, because they've been actually effective. And before that, there was local elections in the Kurdish region. There are 12 provinces where we used to have conflicts, and all provinces, the Kurdish party got the municipal mayorships. So in this sense, as a matter of fact, the leader Abdullah Öcalan was right. The peace talks were actually successful for Kurds and for Turkey and for all of us, because on the one hand there was no violence, on the other hand really Kurdish people actually were going back to normality, and Kurdish party, the political actor, was gaining more in politics through elections, local and general. But after that, everything went to 180-degree opposite. We actually start having conflicts, assassinations, bombings, and fights between, the Turkish security forces and the PKK members in some of the parts of the, southeastern provinces in Turkey. And the actual day, the first assassination of two police by the PKK members was on the 23rd of June 2015. And since then, actually, we have a conflict, we have actually killings, we have, the erosion of normality, deterioration of, normal everyday life, and everything actually going terrible. And lots of PKK members got killed. More than 300 Turkish security forces have been actually killed. So in this sense, we have actually a return to conflict and violence, and the normality has been replaced by again, total uncertainty, in everyday life. As a matter of fact, after the conflict, I went to Diyarbakir, which is one of the key, maybe the key actually province in the Kurdish region, and it was terrible. And on the one hand, you walk on the streets, but on the other hand, part of Diyarbakir were seized by military and security forces and PKK members in the districts and the neighborhoods. So there was a sort of big non-stop fighting between the state and the PKK forces. So in this sense, right now, we have a new stage in the conflict with what we call two Ankara massacres. One was actually a bombing of the car just in front of the air forces and the Turkish parliament 4 weeks ago, and last Sunday there was also a bombing in Ankara again, right in downtown, very close to the first bombing happened, but this time the target was civilians. The first target was the military service bus, and so 37 civilians, young youth, going to university, going to high school, were killed in the bus, public transportation bus. So in this sense, we have not only conflict in the region, we have the widening or widespreading of conflict towards the western part of Turkey in capital city. I live in Istanbul. The German consulate closed, the consulate, and also asked the German high school to close itself. And the whole Turkey is went back to this weird, very down mood, and people are angry, people are sad, people are concerned, people are fearing for for their lives, what's gonna happen. So in this sense, from normality to violence, Turkey actually kind of thrown into this grip of violence, grip of instability, grip of insecurity very, very fastly. Right now, we have a very serious crisis. Why this is happening? It is hard to pinpoint the main reason, but to my reading and to my understanding, and when I talk to Kurdish actors in the region, when I talk to some of the the government members and the state officers in Ankara, as a matter of fact, last Sunday I was in Ankara, and I actually passed the place 25 minutes before the bombing happened, and going to the airport to come back to Istanbul, and both in terms of the reason why the peace talks ended, and also the reason why this conflict occurred and grew in an accelerated way. You get not what happens in Turkey, but what happens in Syria as the main reason. And
yeah, I was going to ask about that because, and not only Syria, but also in Iraq, with the growing independence of the Kurdish minorities in those areas, that must be having an effect on the Kurdish minority in Turkey. Is that right?
Yes, but since the peace talks, Turkish government, the AK Party government, has been good relations with the southern Kurdistan or the northern Iraq, Barzani, and the Kurdish actors there. But the Turkish government's relation with the Syrian Kurds, PYD and YPG. PYD is the Syrian Kurdish organization. YPG is the one that actually fights against the ISIL. That the government's relation with PYD/YPG, the Kurdish actors in Syria, have been problematic, and the government thinks of these guys as the terror organization, as a main threat to Turkish territorial integrity and security. But on the other hand, things get more complicated because, for instance, for the point of view of the United States, the PYD/YPG are the only Kurdish actors, are the only guys on, the boot on the ground fighting against the ISIL. So there is also, a problematic relationship between the United States and Turkey when it comes to how Turkey should deal with the Kurds in Syria. But, the Syrian crisis is actually seems to be the main cause for two reasons. One actually is, for instance, you probably follow yesterday when the Geneva talks are going okay, and when Russia actually decided to withdraw some of its armed forces from Syria, the Syrian Kurds, PYD and YPG, declared some sort of state and federal autonomy, and autonomy in the likely federal situation in the future of Syria. Of course, this actually is perceived by Turkey as actually a threat to Turkey's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and right. The Turkish government thinks that this would actually widespread, and the Kurds in Turkey also go for some sort of local right. sovereignty, stuff like this. So, but on the other hand, the puzzle occurs, as we see the situation from the peace talks and from what is going on in the Middle East, and when we do so, for instance, people like me and a bunch of us suggest that, as we did actually do throughout the peace talks, there is no reason why the Turkish government and the PYD, YPG, the Syrian Kurds, why this relationship should be problematic, hostile, and conflictual. As a matter of fact, there is actually a possibility that there could be a bargain between the Turkish state and Kurds in Turkey, Kurds in Iraq, and Kurds in Syria. And as a matter of fact, one of the dimensions, one of the important, defining characteristics of the peace talks when it comes to foreign affairs, when it comes to Turkey's engagement with the Middle East, was what was called the Great Bargain, grand bargain between Turkey and Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq. As a matter of fact, the Iraqi situation is okay. Turkey might go back to the peace talks, but this part has been problematic, and the interdependency, the relationship of collaboration and cooperation has not been established between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds. This seems to be the main
Fuat,
reason.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we've actually run out of time. But we definitely need to pick this up again because this is such an important issue, and it shows how I think the whole crisis region in Syria and Iraq has spilled over basically into Turkey. It seems from what you're saying to some extent. Of course, there's internal dynamics in Turkey at work as well, I believe. But let's pick this up again another time. And thanks so much for joining us. And I'm really sorry that I had to cut you off because we ran out of time. But thanks again for joining us.
Okay, thank you, and have a good broadcasting. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.